Across Sweden, enormous stones were raised, carved, and arranged with absolute intention, yet their meanings remain uncertain. Why does Aile's stones align with the sun, but hold no confirmed grave? Why were hundreds of ships and rituals carved into Tanum's rock with no explanation left behind? Why does Sweden's largest burial mound remain unopened? And why were entire cemeteries shaped like ships facing the sea? Were these monuments practical, symbolic, or something archaeology still can't fully explain? And what were they trying to communicate to those who came after? Aile's stones. Along the low ridgeline above the Baltic at Kåseberga, where the land tilts gently toward the sea and the horizon remains unusually open, Aile's stones settles into the landscape with a restraint that makes its presence easy to miss until one stands within it, where 59 massive boulders, each weighing several tons, trace the elongated outline of a ship poised eternally on dry land, its bow and stern lifted slightly higher than the flanks, its axis aligned with a confidence that feels intentional even if its purpose remains unresolved. The stones are not exotic in material, quarried locally from granite and sandstone, weathered by centuries of wind, salt and frost, their surfaces softened rather than sharpened by time, and their arrangement does not announce itself with monumental excess, but with proportion and balance, measuring roughly 67 metres from end to end, large enough to dominate the ridge, yet scaled precisely to it, as though calibrated to the slope, the prevailing winds, and the long views westward toward the setting sun. Archaeological investigation places the construction most securely in the late Iron Age, around the 6th or 7th century CE, based on radiocarbon dating of charcoal recovered from hearth-like features near the stones and from soil beneath them, though earlier activity at the site is evident, suggesting the ridge held significance long before the current configuration was assembled, and this layered use complicates any simple narrative of origin. Ship-shaped stone settings are not unique in Scandinavia, appearing across Sweden, Denmark, and the Baltic Islands as funerary monuments associated with elite burials, symbolic vessels intended to carry the dead into the afterlife. Yet Aile's stones stands apart in scale, visibility, and apparent lack of an accompanying grave, as no central burial has been conclusively identified within the setting despite repeated surveys, leaving its function open to interpretation without removing it from known cultural traditions. The absence of a grave has encouraged scrutiny of other features, particularly the alignment of the stones with solar events, as observers have long noted that the sun sets near the northwest stone at the summer solstice and rises near the southeast stone at the winter solstice, with intermediate alignments marking equinoxes, patterns that appear persuasive when witnessed but remain debated in academic literature due to the challenges of confirming intentionality in a structure that has endured shifting stones, erosion, and human interference over more than a millennium. Some stones have clearly moved, whether from frost heave, agricultural activity, or early restoration efforts that sought to straighten fallen boulders without precise knowledge of their original positions. And this movement complicates attempts to reconstruct exact sightlines from the time of construction, introducing uncertainty into claims of astronomical precision, even as the general orientation remains undeniable. Excavations have revealed traces of fire pits and burned stones near the centre, suggesting gatherings, rituals, or feasting, activities consistent with ceremonial use rather than habitation. And the elevated location would have made the site visible from the sea, a landmark for those travelling along the coast, reinforcing its role as a place meant to be seen as well as experienced. The name itself, Aile's Stones, is a much later attribution, emerging in medieval folklore that linked the monument to a legendary king named Eil, a narrative overlay that reflects the human impulse to personalize the ancient rather than preserve its anonymity, And similar legends across Scandinavia have repeatedly attached heroic figures to prehistoric monuments whose original builders were long forgotten. Geological studies confirm that the stones were transported from nearby sources, some dragged uphill from considerable distances, a labour-intensive undertaking that implies coordinated effort and social organisation, yet not on a scale that exceeds what is known of Iron Age communities in southern Scandinavia, whose capacity for monument building is well documented in burial mounds, fortifications and assembly sites. What remains unresolved is why this particular ridge, why this scale, and why a ship without a body, if indeed no burial was ever present, and whether the absence reflects deliberate choice or the erosion of evidence beyond recovery. Theories proposing a purely calendrical function encounter the reality that practical timekeeping did not require such an imposing structure, while strictly funerary interpretations struggle with a lack of human remains, leaving a middle ground in which symbolism, ritual, and seasonal observance may have intersected without fully collapsing into any single modern category. The site's long life has further blurred its original meaning, as medieval travellers, early antiquarians, 19th century romantics, and modern tourists have each approached it with different expectations, occasionally altering stones, recording alignments, or framing the monument through the intellectual fashions of their time. From mythic kings to solar temples, layers of interpretation accumulating, much like the soil beneath the stones. Standing within the setting today, the sea audible, but not always visible, the horizon wide and the sky dominant, the structure resists definitive explanation, not through obscurity or damage, but through coherence, functioning too well as a space to be dismissed as accidental and too ambiguously to be confined to a single purpose, embodying a mode of monument building in which meaning was likely experienced rather than inscribed. Ailey's stones does not contradict archaeology so much as it tests the edges of what material evidence can comfortably explain, reminding us that societies capable of moving and arranging stone with such care were also capable of layering intention, ritual, memory, orientation and display into forms that do not yield easily to modern classification. And as the sun continues to rise and set along roughly the same arc it has traced for centuries, the stones remain fixed on their ridge, neither confirming nor denying the interpretations projected onto them, but quietly sustaining a dialogue between landscape, time, and human presence that has yet to reach a final conclusion. Tanum rock carvings. Across the granite outcrops of northern Bohuslän, where the land rises in shallow, smoothed swells, shaped by retreating ice and ancient shorelines, the rock carvings of Tanum appear not as a single site, but as a dispersed archive etched directly into the exposed bedrock, a scattering of images that only fully reveal themselves when light strikes at a low angle and shadows trace the grooves cut by hands working more than 3,000 years ago. The carvings lie today among forests, farms, and quiet roads. Yet, when they were made during the Nordic Bronze Age, roughly between 1700 and 500 BCE, this terrain was a coastal fringe, its polished granite slopes descending toward bays and inlets that have since lifted well above sea level through post-glacial rebound, subtly shifting the context of every figure without erasing its connection to water, movement, and exchange. Boats dominate the imagery. Long, slender vessels with upturned prows and rhythmic crews indicated by vertical strokes, sometimes carrying weapons, sometimes animals, sometimes nothing at all, repeated across panels as if insistence itself carried meaning, while human figures appear with raised arms, exaggerated hands, or paired in ambiguous interactions that resist simple narrative reading. Weapons, especially axes and spears, recur with a regularity that suggests symbolic weight beyond their practical use, and circular forms, often interpreted as suns or shields, hover among the scenes without anchoring themselves to a single explanation. The carvings were pecked rather than incised, each groove laboriously hammered into hard granite, a commitment of time and effort that far exceeds what casual marking would require, implying that the act of carving was as significant as the images produced, possibly repeated across generations as panels were added to, modified, or re-emphasized. Archaeological context offers no settlements directly adjacent to the most densely carved rocks, nor any graves conclusively tied to the imagery. And this absence has shifted interpretation away from domestic or funerary functions toward the idea of Tanum as a ritualized landscape, a place visited rather than inhabited, where meaning was activated through presence, movement, and perhaps seasonal gatherings. Many panels are positioned along natural routes through the terrain or near what would have been shorelines at the time, reinforcing a relationship between the carvings and travel, whether by sea or land, and the boats themselves, varied in size and form, may reflect not literal vessels, but idealized representations of journeys that extended beyond the visible horizon. The repetition of motifs across kilometers of rock suggests shared conventions and a coherent symbolic language, yet that language remains only partially legible, as no written tradition accompanies it, leaving interpretation dependent on pattern, comparison, and context rather than translation. Some figures appear to be engaged in processions or ritual acts, arms raised in gestures that could signal invocation, celebration, or command, while others are static, reduced to outlines that emphasize posture over identity, as though individuality was secondary to role. Later editions complicate the picture further, as some carvings date to the early Iron Age, overlapping chronologies that indicate the landscape retained significance long after the Bronze Age worldview that produced its earliest images had shifted, suggesting continuity of place even as belief systems evolved. The UNESCO designation recognizes not just the artistic richness of the carvings, but their value as evidence of a maritime-oriented society whose power and cohesion depended on networks of exchange stretching across the Baltic and beyond, a world in which bronze itself arrived from distant sources and required social mechanisms to acquire, distribute, and ritualize. Yet despite decades of study, key questions remain unresolved, including why certain panels are densely packed while nearby surfaces remain untouched, whether the carvings were originally highlighted with paint or other materials now lost, and how their meanings were communicated to those who encountered them for the first time. Experimental archaeology has shown how quickly carvings can fade without maintenance, implying that many images were likely refreshed or recut, acts that would have reactivated their significance and reaffirmed communal memory, turning the rock itself into a medium of continuity rather than a static record. Interpretations that frame the imagery as mythological narratives encounter the difficulty that the scenes do not repeat in fixed sequences, while readings focused on fertility, solar worship, or warrior ideology each illuminate certain motifs, while leaving others unexplained, suggesting that the carvings may not conform to a single symbolic system, but instead operate as a layered visual field where meanings overlapped without requiring resolution. The physical experience of the site reinforces this ambiguity, as the carvings are rarely visible all at once, revealing themselves gradually as one moves across the landscape, bends low to the rock, or waits for the light to shift, an engagement that privileges patience and attentiveness over immediate comprehension. In this sense, Tanum resists reduction to illustration or diagram, functioning instead as an environment shaped by repeated human action, where image, stone, and setting combine to create a form of expression that was never meant to be detached from place. The people who carved these rocks left no names, no dates, no explanations, yet their marks endure with a clarity that feels deliberate rather than accidental, suggesting confidence that the act of carving itself was sufficient to transmit meaning across time. As forests grew, shorelines rose, and societies transformed, the images remained, neither fully decoded nor forgotten, continuing to occupy the boundary between documentation and ritual. And it is within that boundary that Tanum's enduring mystery resides, not in what archaeology cannot explain outright, but in what it can describe in detail without ever exhausting the significance of marks made by hands that understood the landscape in ways that remain only partially accessible today. Anundshög Burial Mound. On the flat agricultural plain outside Västerås, where the land stretches with little interruption and the sky seems unusually expansive, Anundshög rises from the fields with a quiet authority that comes not from height alone, but from placement, its broad grass-covered dome asserting itself as a focal point in a landscape otherwise defined by horizontality. At nearly 9 metres high and 64 metres in diameter, it is the largest burial mound in Sweden, a constructed hill whose symmetry remains evident despite centuries of weathering, grazing and cultivation around its base, and whose scale immediately signals that it was intended to be seen from a distance, long before modern roads and farmsteads enclosed it. Archaeological evidence places its construction in the late Iron Age, most likely during the Vendel period around the 6th or 7th century CE, a time marked by the emergence of powerful regional elites, increased social stratification, and the consolidation of authority through visible monuments rather than hidden graves. Yet, despite its prominence, the mound has never been fully excavated, and no burial chamber has been definitively identified, leaving its interior largely intact and its original contents inferred rather than known, a rarity among monuments of comparable size. Surrounding the mound is a carefully arranged ceremonial complex that includes stone ship settings, standing stones, and processional alignments, all oriented with a deliberateness that suggests Anundshög functioned as more than an isolated grave, instead forming the nucleus of a broader ritual and political landscape. The stone ships, constructed of large glacial boulders set in elongated ovals, echo maritime symbolism common throughout Scandinavia, yet their placement inland underscores that the ship here was an idea rather than a vessel, a metaphor for transition, authority, or ancestral journey, rather than seafaring alone. Early medieval texts, written centuries after the mound's construction, associate the site with a legendary king named Anund, a figure who occupies the uncertain territory between history and myth. And while such accounts cannot be taken as direct evidence, they reflect a persistent cultural memory that linked the mound to rulership and lineage. The surrounding plain would have been a strategic location in the Iron Age, fertile and well connected by waterways that once extended closer to the site, allowing movement of people, goods, and influence, and the mound's dominance over this landscape can be read as a statement of control as much as commemoration. Geophysical surveys suggest complex internal structures within the mound, possibly including multiple construction phases, hinting that Anundshög may have grown over time rather than being raised in a single event, an accretion of memory that mirrors the gradual consolidation of power it likely represented. Evidence of assembly areas nearby strengthens the interpretation of the site as a place of gathering, where legal decisions, seasonal rituals, or dynastic affirmations could have taken place in the presence of the ancestors, the mound serving as both witness and symbol. Fire-cracked stones and traces of burning around the site point to feasting or ceremonial activity, reinforcing the idea that the monument was activated through repeated use rather than sealed off after burial. Yet the absence of excavation leaves open fundamental questions about who, if anyone, lies within the mound, whether it contains a single elite burial, multiple interments, or even no body at all, a possibility that complicates the assumption that size must correspond directly to funerary function. Comparable mounds across Scandinavia have yielded cremations, inhumations, rich grave goods, or cenotaphs built to honour absent individuals, and without intrusive investigation. Anundshög resists definitive classification among them. The restraint shown in leaving the mound unexcavated reflects a modern archaeological caution, acknowledging that excavation is an irreversible act and that future methods may yield insights unavailable today. But it also means that Anundshög continues to operate partly in the realm of inference, its meaning constructed through context rather than contents. Over centuries, the mound has remained a reference point in local identity, surviving Christianization, agricultural reform, and industrialization, with its symbolic gravity largely intact, even as its original ideological framework faded. Standing beside it now, one is confronted not with elaborate stonework or visible chambers, but with mass and silence, a reminder that in some societies, authority and remembrance were expressed through the shaping of earth itself, transforming labour into landscape. Anundshög does not present a puzzle through missing fragments or eroded inscriptions, but through deliberate opacity, a monument whose significance was once self-evident to those who gathered around it, and is now approached through models, parallels, and probabilities. Its enduring presence suggests that whatever narrative it once anchored, whether dynastic, ritual, or territorial, was powerful enough to warrant a monument that could outlast the stories told about it, leaving behind a form that continues to organise space and attention long after the names, events and intentions that shaped it have slipped beyond confident recovery. Kungagraven I Kivik. Near the southeastern coast of Skåne, where rolling farmland meets the subdued light of the Baltic and the ground holds the memory of older shorelines, Kungagraven I Kivik lies low and understated, a Bronze Age burial monument whose significance is concealed rather than proclaimed, its presence marked not by towering height, but by the careful assembly of stone beneath a mound that once blended almost seamlessly into its surroundings. Constructed around 1400 BCE, during a period when long-distance exchange networks brought bronze, amber and ideas into southern Scandinavia, the grave consists of a central stone cist built from massive slabs, enclosed by a circular setting of curbstones, and originally covered by an earthen mound, approximately 75 metres in diameter, making it one of the largest known Bronze Age graves in the region, despite its modest profile today. The monument came to broader attention in the 18th century, when parts of the mound were disturbed by quarrying, an intrusion that inadvertently revealed carved stone slabs lining the burial chamber, images whose survival owed more to chance than design, and whose exposure would permanently alter how the site was understood. These carvings, pecked into the inner faces of the slabs, depict boats with raised prows, human figures, animals, weapons, and enigmatic symbols, arranged in sequences that suggest intention without yielding a single settled interpretation, a visual language that resonates with the rock art of Tanum, yet appears here within an enclosed funerary context. Archaeological investigation has confirmed that the grave was reused and modified, with evidence of cremated remains and later disturbances, complicating efforts to associate the imagery with a single individual or event, while the original burial may have been removed or displaced long before modern excavation began. The presence of boat imagery within the chamber reinforces the centrality of maritime symbolism in Bronze Age Scandinavia, yet the setting of these images inside a sealed space distinguishes Kungagraven from open-air carvings, suggesting that the act of viewing may have been restricted to select participants, or that the images were intended for the deceased rather than the living. The grave goods recovered from the site are sparse compared to other elite burials of the period, a disparity that has fueled debate over whether wealth was expressed here through material offerings or through monumentality and symbolism instead, shifting emphasis from objects to imagery and architecture. Geological analysis of the stone slabs indicates they were sourced locally, but their size and the precision with which they were positioned imply careful planning and coordinated labour, reflecting a social structure capable of mobilising resources for purposes that were as much ideological as practical. The mound's coastal proximity would have connected it visually and conceptually to seaborne routes of exchange, reinforcing the interpretation of the grave as embedded within a wider maritime world rather than an isolated inland monument. Yet despite extensive study, the meaning of the carvings remains unresolved, as attempts to read them as narratives encounter inconsistencies, while symbolic interpretations struggle to explain why certain motifs appear only once while others are repeated, suggesting a selective logic that has not survived its cultural context. Some scholars have proposed that the imagery represents cosmological beliefs, with boats carrying the sun or the dead across a liminal realm, while others emphasize social identity, seeing the grave as a statement of power rooted in control of maritime networks, interpretations that are not mutually exclusive but remain difficult to test archaeologically. The history of the monument itself adds another layer of complexity, as reconstruction efforts in the 20th century reassembled the cist and partially restored the mound. Decisions that preserved the site, but also fixed it into a particular modern understanding of how it should appear, inevitably influencing how it is perceived today. What endures most clearly is the sense that Kungagraven was designed as a space where imagery, architecture, and burial were inseparable, each reinforcing the other without reliance on written explanation. The grave does not withhold its mystery through damage or loss alone, but through the specificity of its expression, offering images that were once legible within a shared worldview and are now only partially accessible through comparison and inference. In this way, Kungagraven i Kivik stands as a reminder that even when prehistoric societies leave behind detailed visual records, the meanings they encoded were embedded within. Practices, beliefs, and experiences that do not survive intact, leaving modern archaeology to reconstruct context, while acknowledging that some aspects of significance remain beyond confident retrieval, preserved in stone but no longer fully translated. Gotland stone ship graves. Along the wind-shaped shores of Gotland, where limestone pavements meet open sea and the horizon feels unusually close, the stone ship graves of the island emerge from the ground with a measured restraint, their outlines defined not by towering walls or enclosed chambers, but by rows of upright stones set carefully into the earth, forming elongated silhouettes that echo the vessels once plying the surrounding Baltic waters. Sites such as Gnisvad and Lillekarlsø preserve some of the most extensive concentrations of these monuments, dating primarily to the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age, a span of centuries during which Gotland occupied a central position in regional exchange networks, its wealth derived from amber, craft production, and maritime connectivity rather than territorial expansion. The ships vary in size, from modest settings only a few metres long to monumental constructions exceeding 30 metres, and this variation appears intentional rather than chronological, suggesting differentiation in status, function, or symbolic emphasis rather than simple technological progression. Archaeological excavation has revealed cremation burials within many of these stone ships, often accompanied by burnt bone, charcoal, and occasional grave goods, confirming their funerary role while simultaneously raising questions about why the ship form was so consistently favoured across generations and contexts. The orientation of the graves frequently aligns with the coastline or with prominent seaward views, reinforcing the sense that these monuments were positioned in dialogue with the maritime landscape rather than imposed upon it. And in several cases, the ships appear arranged in clusters, creating cemeteries that read less as collections of individual graves and more as coherent statements of identity. The stones themselves are local limestone, selected for shape and size rather than uniformity, with taller stones marking prow and stern and lower ones tracing the sides, a visual grammar that remains remarkably stable despite regional and temporal variation. Unlike the carved imagery of mainland sites, the Gotland ship graves rely on form alone to convey meaning, an economy of expression that suggests the shape itself carried sufficient symbolic weight to communicate concepts of journey, transition, and belonging. Some ships contain multiple cremations, indicating reuse over time, and complicating the notion of a single voyage for a single individual, instead pointing toward a collective or ancestral dimension in which the monument functioned as a repository of lineage rather than a final destination. The absence of rich grave goods in many of these burials has prompted debate over whether social status was downplayed in favour of communal identity, or whether wealth was expressed through the labour invested in construction and the prominent placement of the monument within the landscape. Gotland's relative scarcity of large burial mounds, compared to mainland Scandinavia, further emphasises the distinctive choices made by its communities, choices that favoured horizontal monumentality and visual integration with seascapes over vertical dominance. Later, Iron Age developments introduced picture stones on the island, richly carved with ships, riders, and scenes of arrival. And while these date centuries after many of the stone ship graves, the continuity of maritime symbolism suggests a deep-rooted conceptual framework in which the ship served as a bridge between worlds, social states, or phases of existence. Yet the precise nature of that bridge remains elusive, as the archaeological record offers form and context, but little direct insight into belief. Environmental changes have also altered the experience of these sites, as shoreline displacement has shifted some ship graves inland, while leaving others exposed to erosion, subtly transforming their relationship to the sea without erasing it. Modern excavation and conservation have preserved many of these settings, but like other stone ship monuments, they have also been subject to restoration that may have altered original alignments, introducing uncertainty into interpretations of orientation and spatial logic. Standing among them today, one is struck not by spectacle but by repetition, the quiet insistence of a form returned to again and again across centuries, suggesting that the ship was not merely a metaphor but a structuring principle through which life, death and memory were organised. The Gotland stone ship graves do not present a single unresolved anomaly so much as a sustained cultural choice whose rationale was once widely understood and is now only partially recoverable, leaving archaeology to trace patterns of practice while accepting that the deeper logic connecting these monuments to lived experience remains largely implicit, carried forward in stone long after the communities that raised them had passed beyond the horizon they so carefully faced. Glimmingehus medieval fortress. Rising from the gently rolling farmland of southeastern Skåne, Glimmingehus asserts itself with a severity that feels deliberate rather than ornamental, its pale stone walls rising abruptly from the surrounding fields, as though the structure were placed there fully formed. A late medieval fortress, whose compact mass and defensive clarity contrast sharply with the open landscape around it. Completed in 1499, at the threshold between the medieval world and the early modern period, Glimmingehus was commissioned by the Danish nobleman Jens Holgersen Ulfstand, a powerful administrator in the Danish crown, and its construction reflects a moment of transition when feudal authority, emerging state power, and new military technologies were converging. Built primarily of limestone and sandstone, the fortress is remarkably well preserved, its walls several metres thick, pierced by narrow openings designed for crossbows and early firearms, and crowned by machicolations that allowed defenders to control the space directly below, features that speak to an architectural language shaped by threat rather than display. Unlike earlier castles that grew organically over centuries, Glimmingehus was planned as a unified structure, its symmetry and internal organisation suggesting careful foresight and access to skilled craftsmen, possibly influenced by fortification styles from continental Europe, where artillery had already begun to reshape military design. The entrance, elevated and once accessed by a wooden drawbridge, reinforces the sense of separation between inside and out, while the absence of elaborate decoration underscores that the fortress was conceived first and foremost as a secure residence rather than a courtly showpiece. Yet within its walls, traces of domestic life complicate the purely martial impression, as hearths, latrines, storage rooms, and a great hall indicate a household designed to function for extended periods, insulated from the surrounding world, both physically and socially. Archaeological study of the site has revealed evidence of advanced engineering for its time, including drainage systems and layered defences that reflect an acute awareness of siege tactics, even as the fortress appears to have never been tested by prolonged warfare, standing instead as a preemptive statement of strength. Its strategic location, controlling routes between inland estates and the coast, situates it within a network of power that extended across the Danish realm, reminding modern observers that Skåne was at the time a frontier of administration rather than a peripheral province. Written records provide more clarity here than at prehistoric sites, yet they do not fully explain why such a heavily fortified residence was deemed necessary in a region that was not experiencing constant conflict, raising questions about whether Glimmingehus was built in response to specific threats or as a symbolic reinforcement of authority in an uncertain political climate. The fortress's later history adds to this ambiguity, as it fell out of use as a noble residence within a century of its completion, repurposed for storage and administration, and eventually left without a central role as military technology evolved beyond its defensive logic. Unlike many castles that were adapted, expanded, or dismantled, Glimmingehus remained largely untouched, its very obsolescence contributing to its preservation and freezing it in a form that reflects a precise historical moment. Legends that later clustered around the site, portraying it as grim, haunted, or oppressive, speak less to documented events than to the psychological effect of its architecture, a structure whose inward focus and lack of warmth invite projection as much as interpretation. In the broader arc of Scandinavian monumental building, Glimmingehus occupies an unusual position, neither ancient nor fully modern, bridging worlds in which power was still anchored to land and stone, even as new forms of governance and warfare were emerging. Its mystery does not lie in uncertainty of date or function, but in the gap between intention and outcome, a fortress built with meticulous care for defence that ultimately served more as a symbol than a battleground. Standing today with its walls intact and its rooms largely empty, Glimmingehus offers a rare opportunity to observe medieval authority stripped of later embellishment, presenting a structure that fulfilled its purpose simply by existing, and in doing so leaves behind a quiet question about how fear, power, and foresight shaped architecture at the very edge of a changing world. Jungfrun stone labyrinth. Off the coast of Småland, rising abruptly from the Baltic as a steep granite island with sheer slopes and a flattened crown, Jungfrun stands apart from the mainland both physically and psychologically, its isolation amplified by centuries of maritime law that cast it as a place to be avoided rather than approached. At its summit, among weathered stone and sparse vegetation shaped by wind and salt, lies a stone labyrinth constructed from small granite blocks, its winding path coiled inward with deliberate care despite the absence of mortar or visible anchoring, a form that appears simple yet resists casual explanation. Stone labyrinths are found across northern Europe, often near coasts, churches, or ancient gathering places, and are generally dated to the medieval or early modern period, though their exact chronology is frequently difficult to establish due to their surface-level construction and susceptibility to reuse or modification. The Jungfrun labyrinth, sometimes called Troy Town or Virgin's Maze, is believed to have taken shape during the Middle Ages, yet the island itself shows evidence of much earlier human visitation, including flint tools and hearths, creating a palimpsest of activity that complicates any attempt to isolate the labyrinth from deeper patterns of significance. The structure follows a classical unicursal design, guiding the walker along a single continuous path toward a central point, a configuration that requires patience rather than choice, and which has been associated elsewhere with ritual movement, symbolic journeying, or acts of protection and containment. No written sources explain why such a form was placed on this particular island, nor who built it, and the absence of associated structures or artifacts nearby leaves its purpose inferred from analogy rather than context. Folklore has filled this silence with cautionary tales, describing Jungfrun as a gathering place for witches, or a site of supernatural danger, narratives that may reflect later attempts to impose moral or spiritual boundaries on a landscape that already felt remote and ambiguous. Archaeological caution separates these stories from evidence, yet acknowledges that places perceived as liminal often attract both ritual activity and legend, reinforcing one another over time. The labyrinth's position near the island's highest point offers wide views of the surrounding sea, a setting that would have heightened the experiential aspect of walking its path, turning a simple act of movement into an encounter with exposure, balance, and orientation. Unlike burial mounds or fortresses, the labyrinth contains no interior, no hidden chamber or accumulated mass, its significance residing entirely in motion and form rather than enclosure or permanence. Its stones, modest in size and easily rearranged, suggest a monument that could be rebuilt or adjusted, raising the possibility that the act of maintenance was integral to its meaning, a repeated reaffirmation rather than a single construction event. Similar labyrinths have been interpreted as fishing rituals, protective devices meant to trap harmful forces, or symbolic journeys enacted before voyages, interpretations that resonate with the maritime context of Jungfrun, without exhausting its potential significance. The island's long-standing status as a national park and its relative inaccessibility have preserved the labyrinth from heavy modification, allowing it to remain in a form that feels quietly provisional, as though it could still be altered by those who understand its purpose. Scientific investigation of the site has focused more on geology and ecology than archaeology, leaving the labyrinth largely unstudied in formal terms. A reminder that not all monuments attract equal scholarly attention, especially when they resist easy categorization. In the broader sequence of Scandinavian sacred and symbolic landscapes, Jungfrun represents a shift from monumentality toward gesture, from mass and permanence to pattern and movement, a different way of marking place that does not dominate the island but lightly occupies it. The labyrinth does not challenge archaeology through contradiction or anomaly, but through its refusal to declare itself, offering a structure that is complete without explanation and meaningful without documentation. As waves continue to break against the island's cliffs and the path of stones remains open to the sky, the labyrinth endures as a quiet articulation of human presence in a setting where isolation, orientation, and repetition converge, leaving behind a form whose significance may never be fully recovered, but whose intentionality remains difficult to dismiss, suspended between practical action and symbolic gesture at the edge of land and sea.